Hello out there. Today we are talking the legal side of love and some of the things that people ignore when they get married, especially when they get married for a second time, those boomers out there. This is valuable information, folks, and I'm really excited to share this with you because I believe in love, but I also believe in planning, right? So, what'd you do last weekend? Did you elope? Did you meet someone new? Did you get married? Well, there may be a few things that you didn't consider, right? Because a wedding can be a spreadsheet from hell, really, as far as logistics are concerned, right? They are beautiful, but behind the scenes, you can be bombarded with tedious things, right? Guest lists. Who do you invite? Who doesn't get invited, right? And dealing with that, gift lists, menus, caterers, the cake, photographers, florists. Do you have a DJ? Do you have a band? You need the church, you need the reception hall, you need the invitations, you need those RSVPs, right? Who sits next to who? Who needs to be separated and kept separated, right? Marriage license, logistics, honeymoon, the whole thing, right? Well, there's something on that list that is not included, and a lot of times it's not included for most people, but I want to talk about that today, and that is prenuptial agreements or even postnuptial agreements. So those of you maybe took a trip to Vegas over the weekend and got married. Maybe you forgot a few things. Well, you still have the ability to do a post-nuptial agreement or an agreement after the wedding, after the marriage, right? So I want to share a story from my wedding just to start today because I got married, and I still love my husband. We got married in a botanical garden in Sarasota, Florida. Have you ever been there? It's a beautiful place. All right. So we had a wedding planner. And the wedding planner wanted me, or more specifically, my dad, to spend in excess, and I'm not making this up, in excess of $10,000 on flowers to decorate the botanical garden. I said no to that. No. She said I shouldn't be worried about it because it's my wedding. Well, I was worried about it, and that didn't happen. But the wedding did happen, and we are still happily married. So that's a good story. Well, weddings can go down to, planning even for the simplest thing, color of the napkins, right? What kind of silverware you're going to use. But most people, like I said, do not talk about or plan for what happens if things don't go as planned. So that's what I'm talking about today. So I'm not trying to be a killjoy. I'm just talking about planning, especially if you've been married before. So before you say, I do a second time, and that includes those boomers out there, you might want to think about prenuptial agreements, or if you didn't do it before your marriage, postnuptial agreements. Those of you out there, like I said, that have been married and maybe you're divorced now, if you didn't do one, do you regret it? It comes with some unintended consequences, which I'm also going to talk about today. But it really is a still overlooked issue. And all the while, unfortunately, about 50% of marriages still end in divorce. So I think this is an important issue. And I think there's some things that you might actually take away from this that make you think differently about these things. Because, modern marriages really have changed, just like our lifestyle has changed, right? So post-nuptial agreements and prenuptial agreements are not for the rich and famous anymore. You hear about Hollywood gurus getting divorced every other month, it seems like, but that's not normal for most of us. But it is still true. Like I said, divorce is on the rise. Even here in the Bible Belt, believe it or not, I was surprised that Tennessee was on the top 10 in the country for numbers of divorces. Maybe Nashville has something to do with that. I don't know, but people just don't stay married as long as they used to, generally speaking. I do have folks that come in here and have been celebrating their weddings 50, 60 years, and sometimes marriages end when spouses die. So that can be another issue why you remarry. It's just not one reason. Everybody's got circumstances that are different. So Tennessee is at the top 10. So is Georgia. So is Alabama. So is Kentucky. All right, so we're surrounded by all these big divorce states down here in the South. And just to be complete, do you know who the number one divorce state is? No, it's not California, believe it or not. Arkansas. That surprised me too. I don't know. Maybe Bill Clinton's got something to do with it. I don't know. But it wasn't California. So okay, we're going to talk about prenuptial agreements. First, what is a prenuptial agreement, right? Well, it's a legally binding contract that engaged people enter into voluntarily before they marry, and it sets some terms and conditions as to, let's say, certain less romantic but necessary parts of marriage. That could include asset protection, right? Yours, his, and what's considered marital property, debt allocation. You know, you want to be liable for the other person's debt? You may be if you don't plan accordingly. And disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. They need to know what you have before you tie the knot. That is crucial. So that is a big issue with enforceability too. So disclose. But, it's surprising because a lot of younger folks are entering into these agreements now too before marriage. But I think that's also because things have changed. People have careers, they're waiting longer, they're starting to accumulate assets, they're having kids later in life. So, they're entering into these agreements, and so are boomers. I've been asked to do quite a number of these now, and they're increasing. So I thought it was worth talking about. So these are the ones, boomers, that is, are slightly older than millennials, and they may have been around the block before. So what might you consider if something happened, right? Well, you come into the marriage with, especially a second marriage, with more property, right? You probably have career history. Maybe it's still ongoing. You got a business. You've got a retirement that's been accumulated. You've got a history. You may have kids, adult children from a previous marriage. You may have plans to give your assets to your children when you're done with them. Do you want it full scale into the new relationship, or do you want some boundaries? That's not that unusual for people to talk about that today and plan that way. You know, like I said, you've got prior children, and that can protect against some future inheritances that might otherwise happen if you don't plan under state law. These are the things you don't know are usually what come and bite you in the what. So this is still a sensitive topic and it deserves some attention, but the risks are significant. Like I said, property, premarital assets, pension accounts, retirement accounts, business ownership. Hey, if you've got wealth in your family, you've got property in your family, what about that family farm that's been passed down generation after generation? Deserves some thought. And as I mentioned, debt, which is often overlooked. I see it in bankruptcy. The spouse gets on the hook for the unsecured debt, believe it or not, and medical debt. There's something called the necessities doctrine, which means the spouse is responsible for the other spouse's medical debt. These are the realities. So I want to talk about this. I want to talk about things you should consider. And I hope it maybe makes your marriage better, because this is not supposed to be about talking about breaking up. It's supposed to be talking about, what you have together, and what you want to do to honor maybe your family history, your children, and so forth. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about the history of prenuptial agreements, and it may not be what you think. Hello, welcome back, Nancy Kogar, and it's boomer time. I'm so glad you're here. Today we're talking about marriages. There's more people getting married more than once. And, when you get married in different parts of stages, seasons of your life, you have to consider certain things. And I'm talking about prenuptial agreements and even postnuptial agreements. These are contracts that you enter into with your betrothed voluntarily and in agreement, where you set out parameters as to maybe stuff you brought to the table before you joined in wedlock. So it's serious stuff, but it's not, believe it or not, it's not a new idea at all. Prenuptial agreements, back when we have more of the traditional nuclear family, were often characterized as, well, an assault on the sanctity of marriage, right? We're two becoming one. And so you're one. You shouldn't need a separate agreement to detail what goes where and to who, right? Well, yes, but, life is not always that simple. And there's the sin thing, right? People do not do what they are supposed to. So that's when agreements are helpful. There's nothing wrong. You have insurance on your house, right? You've got insurance on your body. Why not have a little insurance on your marriage? So that's where the idea of premarital contracts come in. And it's not new. In fact, when I was doing some research for the show, I love information. I love history, and looking back, prenuptial agreements, these kind of premarital contracts date back even to ancient Egypt. They had arranged marriages, right? That were part of the culture. Same thing in those European kingdoms. You remember Henry VIII? I mean, he got married what, 6 times? He didn't do it the traditional way. He sent them to the Tower of London and other places, chopped off a few heads too. But marriages back then were more about making political alliances, right, than love a lot of times. So the oldest prenuptial agreement that has been found, from what I saw, was nearly 2,000 years old. So it was a Hebrew contract which set out the terms of marriage between the bride and the husband, and more specifically, looking at the dowry or the property that, came as part of that marriage from the bride's family. So that's how much is paid to the marriage, or more so the husband, right, for the privilege of marrying into the bride's family. So, and it also protected the bride's access to that property if the husband died, which was more common back then at a younger age, right? But still happens. So in the US, here in the United States, New York was one of the first states to pass a law protecting a married woman's right to property. That wasn't until 1948. So rights were not previously guaranteed. In fact, I've talked about this before, but women were considered chattel property for some time. And we didn't have the right to vote until, turn of the last century, right? So rights, you think about these things and you think, it takes action to protect your rights. So that's why I'm bringing this up today. Well, so what do you do? Is it worth taking a look at prenuptial and postnuptial agreements before you say, I do? Like I said, we normally associate these with celebrities, right? And the wealthy, star of marriage of the month, right? But that's not normal. But, things have changed where more older adults are getting married for a second time. No one wants to be alone, right? It's okay. It's okay. But I just think that planning is always makes things better. So there's an attorney out in Hollywood, and she is actually known as the Hollywood Divorce Queen. I wouldn't want that title, but that's her title, Laura Wasser. And she offered 3 main components with a prenuptial agreement. And I say really that there should be 4. So her 3 are: agree what happens if you divorce, agree what happens if someone dies, and as far as property is concerned, decide what's included, what's not, and this is important, though, whether you as a couple want to opt in or opt out of your particular state's inheritance rights. Okay, so pay attention to state law, because state laws are all different, of course, but they all, for the most part, include spousal rights to your estate. So this can run afoul, and I've talked about that before with, second marriages where one person was on the deed and there wasn't necessarily any spousal inheritance for the marital home. You don't want those kind of surprises. You don't, and they happen. So my 4, though: disclose, 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 right? All property, the character of that property, to the other involved, because if you don't, you may have a problem with enforceability if and when you need it. So, like I said, these agreements are voluntary, written, and you have to exchange some value Fair and reasonable disclosures what needed. But there's still people that avoid these agreements. They say they're unromantic. They vowed the trust to each other. They don't need to worry about that or maybe figure it out later. Well, that's all great, but you should see how busy my partner who does divorces here in the office is. And it just doesn't work out that way. So it's not about mistrust. It's about clarity, just like estate planning, which I talk about a lot. This is a planning issue. It's about controlling or giving yourself some rights to your decisions in the future. You're protecting yourself. You don't want the courts to decide what you get or what you don't get, right? They'll decide if you don't have an agreement. So if you're older, what are some special considerations that you should make? I've talked about some of those, but really here are the top reasons why boomers out there may want to consider the agreement before marriage. And even if you lose a spouse, you're in church, you lose a spouse, and it doesn't take long for those casserole ladies to start coming over and people get remarried because they don't want to be alone. And that's fine. But, if you've got a history, you've got kids, you've got property, these things deserve your attention. So, number one on the list would be children from a prior marriage. All right. You don't, even inadvertently, you don't want issues as to future inheritances and wealth transfers pursuant to state law. I mentioned that. Boomers, like I've said, they represent the largest expected wealth transfer in the history of our country. Okay? They've accumulated a lot of things. They've worked really hard. And when they pass away, those things are being transferred to somebody, right? They're either being transferred subject to an estate plan that you've made, or if you don't, the default is the state law, right? And the law doesn't always work the way we think it should or what we would think it would. So I just spent the last couple days in Nashville at the legislature, and let me tell you, that was interesting to watch. They've got thousands of bills moving through committees, and sometimes there's not a lot of consideration or time for consideration of some of these bills that then become laws, and then they got to come back and be corrected or they're struck down as unconstitutional. So I'm going down a little bit of a rabbit trail, but that just tells you, though, that the law doesn't necessarily work the way you assume it does. So planning is the best way to avoid that. Boomers entering into second marriages typically have more assets. And quite frankly, they have less time. So if you're 50 and you get married for a second time, chances are for the last, 30 plus years, you've been working and accumulating retirement and things like that. And if you lost a spouse, there was property in that marriage that you also bring with you, not to mention the kids, right? So there is a need to plan as part of these marriages. Typically, money, right? Cash, retirement, property, investments. Before you start making joint accounts and things like that, you really need to consider what happens when you characterize assets that way. I talk a lot about that as part of my estate planning. I care less really about how much you have. I care more about how you hold your assets, because depending on the character of assets, they pass differently. And titling of assets can be a make or break thing. So that is hugely important. So just for that sake alone, you're not planning a divorce. You're just planning to deal with what you're bringing into the marriage. But the other issue is, again, you're older. Your health isn't probably as good as it was when you were 21, or at least you're feeling it, right? So their potential impact on long-term health care, planning for that, right? You may change your insurance. Sure, you've got Medicare, but maybe there's some different things that come into the picture. And as I've talked about often, Medicaid, or the assistance for long-term care, which is income-based, that can be hugely affected by a change in your property. So again, I mean, these are just no-brainers to me, but for some reason, people just don't look at this stuff, and it can really cause some unintended consequences, which I want to get into some of that before we break. But a long-term health care, Medicaid planning, long-term end-of-life planning, that has a lot to do with the money that you have. Every time you end a marriage, you're ending a contract, you're taking something away in that, and whether it's more or less, you need to deal with that before you enter into a new agreement. That just makes sense. So like I said, 50% of marriages end in divorce. So, and the second time around, you may just be less starry-eyed, I guess, than the first time around, right? Don't be pessimistic. Maybe you'll meet the love of your life, and that's important. I don't like to see anybody go through life alone, but I like people to preserve their rights. So if you are not, here's a point I wanted to make, okay? Because I see a lot of people living together, right? Let me tell you, if you are not legally married, you want to think about that too. Because an agreement, just a simple contract as far as your relationship is concerned, is worthy of your attention. Because when you're not legally married, you don't have the same rights as someone that's married legally. And secondly, let that sink in, okay? Because there's some of you out there that aren't married, and you've got some really complicated circumstances going on. But if you're not married, you don't have the same rights to your significant other's property or so forth than you would if you were married. But under state law, your relationship could be considered what we call a de facto partnership under the law. Two people coming together and agreeing for a specific purpose. That's a partnership. So, like I said, what you don't know can hurt you, and that could really limit or create a possible future claim in property, even if you're not married. So, take some time to pay attention to these things. Isn't this interesting? Yeah, the emotional part of it should not be the only part you consider, because it's a contract. You've got an agreement to be together, to help each other, to love each other, till death do you part, right? And sometimes we have an opportunity to do that more than once. Your first spouse passes, and you may meet somebody new, but you need to think about what you're bringing to the table. That's how I usually say it, right? We're bringing different things to the table than we did the first time around. Needs planning. So I'm going to take a quick break, and when I come back, I've got something exciting to share with you, and I'm also going to talk about those unintended consequences if you don't plan for these types of things. I'll be right back. Well, we are talking prenuptial and postnuptial agreements. We are talking terms and conditions for some of the things you bring into the marriage. And it's really an opportunity to, if you look at it optimistically, to avoid conflict down the road, right? Set some standards, have mutual understanding, talk through these things, have some transparency. You may never have an issue. You may never have an issue when it comes to some of the other things you plan for, but you still plan, right? So we are talking unintended consequences. I thought it was important to share just a couple examples before we end our time together. So these are real life nightmares that I've found online for people that did not have prenuptial agreements. So there was a successful businesswoman with lots of success behind her, who remarried and skipped the prenuptial agreement. Well, she did get divorced. And unfortunately, in this circumstance, she was forced to pay her ex-husband spousal support from her retirement for 15 years. See, it doesn't always work, woman, man. The court's looking at it and wants an equitable distribution of property. So that's how that happened in that case. And undoubtedly, she had something to think about for 15 years. And I'm sure it delayed her retirement plans. So you don't want that to happen to you. Here's another one, a little more broad, but just as bad. So let's say you marry Mr. Wonderful and he ends up being Mr. Not So Wonderful and he hid some things from you. Could be an asset. How about a debt, like a priority lien for the IRS? Those things are not easy to get rid of. You could be included with the liability. Don't do that. Ouch. I don't like that. So, but having these conversations can help with some of this stuff. It can help to find, a nice reinforced core message that marriage is both emotional and has legal aspects. And planning is about protection, not pessimism. Say that 10 times fast. So you insure your house, you insure your health, right? You insure your life. Why wouldn't you insure your marriage? That's something to think about. So I hope you've enjoyed this today. I have. I always learn things when I prepare for these shows, and I love passing it along. Hey, guess what? Boomer Time Blueprint is out and available. I'm so excited about that too. You can order a copy, and I would love to have a copy in your hands. It's got great resources, great information about planning. You need this book. You need to get this book for someone you know that doesn't know any better about the things that they need to be planning for. You can get it on my website, nancykogar.com, and you can also get it on Amazon, Boomer Time Blueprint. Available audiobook, paperback, large print soon. Let me know what you think. And don't forget to like the podcast. You're helping me to reach more people. So I thank you, and I thank you for being a part of this community, and I will see you next time.